Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to see y'all. Thank you so much for coming to this amazing presentation. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Doctora Selma de León Iznaga. Yes, we're super excited. Just a few housekeeping things. Bathrooms are straight in the back, so through these doors and through the back doors, bathrooms are there. We'll go from 7:30 to about 8:40, and there will be some question and answers, and then the curtain will open for a dessert reception. And we'll have a couple of mics, or you can project your voice when, if you have a question when the time comes. For CEUs, if you registered already, Dr. Jenna St. David will email everyone after the event to prompt everyone to complete an evaluation and to get for you to get your CEU certificate. If you arrived and you didn't register, welcome. If you need a CEU, you can reach out to me and I can give you the email for Dr. St. David so that she can give you the eval and so you can get that certificate. If you are a counseling student and would like to join CSJ, please email csj@ssw.edu, or you can email me and I can give you that address. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. The Latinx Counseling Concentration and Counselors for Social Justice are excited to present Dr. Selma Iznaga. Dr. Selma Iznaga is an associate professor in the Department of Counseling at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. It's one of the nation's largest Hispanic institutions. Hispanic serving institutions. Dr. Iznaga has held numerous leadership positions in the Texas Counseling Association and the American Counseling Association. In 2007, Dr. Iznaga founded, this is amazing, y'all, founded the chapter of the Texas Counselors for Social Justice, a division of TCA dedicated to addressing the oppression and marginalization of ethnic and social minorities. Most recently, her clinical work, advocacy, and scholarship are directed at the treatment of immigration-related trauma at the Texas-Mexican border. Dr. Iznaga serves on the board of directors of the Young Center for Immigrant Children and was recently appointed as the coordinator of clinical services for the Texas-Mexico Projects by Counselors Without Borders, an international nonprofit organization serving the global mental health needs of communities following political, natural, and man-made disasters. And on a personal note, I came to know Dr. Iznaga by one of our mutual professors, Dr. Dana Comstock, at St. Mary's University, and she encouraged me to go to the American Counseling Association conference. And I don't remember the year, but part of the reason why I was introduced was because I was specifically looking for a role model when I was a doctoral student, and I was looking for a counselor educator, a Latina, who was doing the work of social justice in the field. And I remember thinking that the world needs to know about Dr. Iznaga and her work, and I still feel that way. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Iznaga.
Now you're getting old when the biography goes on and on and on. And I'm like, oh yeah, I did that, and then I did that. Just from being old. How are you guys doing? So good to be here with you. I am always so humbled when people show up to hear about the work that we're doing at the border. With so much discrimination and so much anti-immigrant sentiment, it's easy to believe that nobody cares about what we're doing down there, and nobody cares about the people that we're serving. So thank you for being here and for wanting to know more about the work that we do. Little bit about myself. I was born and raised on the border. My mother is a Mexican native, Mexican immigrant. My dad was born in Bishop, Texas. Had a really interesting ethnic identity dynamic going on in my household. My mom had a really, really strong sense of who she was as a Mexican. My dad lived through Jim Crow, and so he was very, very sensitive to discrimination. And my mom was like, "What? Why wouldn't they like us? We're awesome." It just didn't occur to her why people would be would discriminate against Mexicans. I was really, really proud to know why my dad named me Selma, why my parents named me Selma. I'm a civil rights baby. They gave me that responsibility at birth. Both of my parents were community activists, community advocates. I grew up doing all kinds of community work. I've tried to raise my kids the same way. I do take my name very, very seriously and believe that we always have to stand up and fight for all human beings, right? I've been working at UT RGV since 2000 when it was UT Brownsville. I started my career working with Mexican economic migrants. About 2012, 2014, we started seeing the surge of Central American migrants who were very, very, very different than Mexican economic migrants. And so my whole career shifted. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that looks like as we move forward. I'm married, got 2 kids, one just out of college, one who's a senior in college. My daughter wants to be an immigration lawyer, trying to talk her out of it. That's tough work. That's tough work. She's determined. She's my pride and joy, and my son is too. Content warning. We're going to talk about some tough stuff. I want to share some stories about the people that I've met and the people that I've had the privilege to work with, and the stories that I am honored to hold, and they're difficult to hear. So if you feel like you need to step out or do that, feel free. I understand. So what we're going to do in the next hour is just look at Title 42 and MPP and what consequences that has had on the border. I want to show you how different it is to work in the field on the border as opposed to traditional mental health counseling services. And then just share one of the interventions that we use that we have found to be very useful with this population, the window of tolerance. How many of you are familiar with the window of tolerance? Yeah, I'm loving it. I use this with all of my clients, and it works really, really well with this population also. So how did we get where we are on the border? For me, everything changed in 2016. And the first executive order in January of 2017 criminalized unlawful entry into the United States. So where we had a catch and release protocol, we now started treating people who were entering the United States without documentation as criminals. That was enforced by the zero tolerance policy in 2018. I sat in courtrooms like that day after day after day. ACLU trained us to be court observers. And so we would watch and make sure that people's rights were being maintained. They were, for the most part, but it was still one of the most humiliating and degrading things I've ever seen happen in my life. Originally, people were brought in en masse in orange jumpsuits, then they ran out of orange jumpsuits. So they would bring people in just in wet clothes. Yeah. And also, let me just say, there's no line to get into. I feel like you all already know this, but there isn't a line that people can get into to lawfully enter the country. It's incredibly expensive. It is incredibly impossible. It's a lottery system. It's impossible. And so there are a lot of desperate people who are entering our country unlawfully because there just isn't really a lawful way to actually do it. I'm not advocating for it, but I am saying that there's another side to that story. There's a reason why people do this. Most of the people that are coming from Central America are fleeing for survival. Whether they are fleeing government oppression, community unrest, civil unrest, gang conscription, abject poverty, terminal poverty, they are fleeing for their lives. And they get to the border, and then there's no way to actually come in lawfully. They have sold everything to be able to come through Mexico on this journey. And when they get here and find there's no other way, a lot of times they come in unlawfully. In 2018, we saw some of the worst violations of human rights ever. And unfortunately, I think we kind of became jaded. And we stopped seeing people in cages. But people were in cages, literally in cages. Incredible human rights violations. I'm really, really proud of my community that stepped up, the humanitarian groups that formed in 2018 to take care of people, because they relied 100% on us for food, for shelter, for everything. And it was a really, really chaotic time. Right around the same time, we had the horrible mess of family separation. I'll never forget a phone call that I received from one of my students who worked in the courthouse, and she said, "Dr. Y, what's going on?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Something's happening. There's people screaming and wailing in the courthouse. It's chaos." And I was like, "I don't know, hold on, I'll find out." So I called our ACLU border strategist and said, "What's happening?" Family separation, which was a deliberate attempt to deter people from coming to our country. It continues to happen. Yeah. In January of 2019, MPP, or Remain in Mexico, was implemented. So what happened is that people who were coming to the border to legally seek asylum in the United States were asked to come to a temporary court. This is down the street from my office. I can walk to these tent courts. They would get a court date, and then they were sent back into Mexico to wait for their court date, which could be like a year out. And so it created some really crazy situations that we're going to talk about. And then in March of 2020, Title 42 was implemented. This is a health policy that's intended to protect the United States from, outside disease and stuff like that. But it stopped NPP even. Now nobody could even come to ask for asylum. But everything came to a screeching halt. So from 2014, we saw all of these changes happening, and every time we thought we were catching up, okay, so now we've got all of these people. It started with a bunch of people lining up at the bridge and living on the bridges because they were bringing people in to request their asylum so slowly. That people literally were living on the bridge, and it's backed up. So we were serving food on the bridge. We were doing psychosocial support on the bridge. And then the government decided the optics weren't good. So they they stationed heavily armed Border Patrol agents right at the top of the bridge where where Mexico becomes the United States. And nobody could cross, even step 1 foot into the United States, because then we would have to process them. Then they started metering and saying, no, we're only letting 1 person in today. We're only letting 2 people in today. So we started seeing the creation. This is the beginning of the tent camps in Mexico. So what happens when you cannot ask for asylum? What happens when you cannot come into the United States after you have fled your country? You probably have 0 resources, and you're at the bridge. Well, you could return to your home country, but you fled your home country for a reason. And can I just say, nobody wants to leave their country. Nobody wants to leave their country. They don't have a choice. There's literally no choice. If they could stay in their countries, they would. And so going back is not an option. What a lot of people did was send their kids across. And this was before Title 42. They would send their kids across because unaccompanied minors were still allowed to enter the country. And so people made the tough decision, well, at least let my kids get into the country, with no idea what would happen to them. But that being a better choice, that was one of the options. There's also staying in a tent camp in Mexico, which the majority of people have done. Unfortunately, there's this thing called the Mexican cartel. And the cartel's business has shifted in large part from a drug operation to human trafficking operation and an extortion, kidnapping and extortion operation. So a lot of the people that are there are kidnapped. They're victims of every crime you can imagine: sexual assault, beatings, murder. There's no security at the tent camps. So the cartel basically has free reign. The cartel also is really good at saying, hey, for a couple of $1,000, we'll get you across. And so it's a perfect storm, right? People are desperate. And then you have the cartel saying, we can change all of this. We can change all of this. You know, give us an IOU and we'll get you across the border. So also entering illegally with the cartel. Those are the choices. Not great ones, right? So, what has happened? We have these tent camps. Really, really, really difficult living conditions. Really difficult living conditions. After, let me see. Well, I think it was before MPP. No, after MPP, we were going to Mexico and doing our services in the tent camps. That all stopped with COVID. We weren't allowed to cross the border anymore. The borders closed, and so we couldn't get through. But we worked in the camps for quite a while. So I want to just put some definitions of trauma up, but I want you to read these just with the understanding that they exist only for our benefit in an abbreviated way for us to understand what people are going through. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about the social location of trauma and diagnoses and how harmful diagnoses can be. But it does give us an abbreviated way to talk about things. So trauma is any event that's overwhelming. It can be your parents getting divorced. It can be your teacher giving you a bad grade, or it can be sexual assault or torture, right? It's subjective. Complex trauma is when it happens repeatedly to the same person. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosis that we give when the traumas have created dysfunction, inability to move through your day. Complex PTSD is not in the DCM. It is an ICD diagnosis, but it's not in the DSM. And it is prolonged and repeated interpersonal trauma occurring under circumstances where escape is impossible. And so there's no doubt that every single person I work with meets the criteria for complex PTSD. from their origin, their country of origin, and what they experienced in their country of origin, to the migration trauma, traveling through Mexico. Even if you have a guide and a coyote, is really, really horrifying. And then the resettlement process itself is such a violation. So that everybody that I meet meets the criteria for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So in addition to the criteria for PTSD, which is things like avoidance, numbing, re-experiencing the events, that kind of thing, we also have these domains for complex PTSD, difficulties with emotional regulation, disturbances in relational capacities, alterations in attention and consciousness, somatic distress, and changes in belief system. Let me share some examples with you. I worked with a woman whose child had been, she had been separated from her child. And she did not want to work with me. Her husband brought her in to see me. And this was, I do a lot of work at a refugee shelter called La Posada that's in my community. So these people were staying at La Posada. And I go once a week and I check in with people that I've seen the week before. And I just walk around the complex and check in with people and tell them who I am and tell them what I do. So this man said, I want you to talk to my wife. And I said, well, if she wants to talk to me, I'm here. And he said, well, she doesn't want to talk to you. And I said, well, that's really up to her. Mm-hmm. He said, well, I'm going to go get her. I'm going to bring her. And he brought her to me. And she was highly, highly agitated and threw up for the first 45 minutes that we sat together. Mm-hmm. She was so upset. The first thing she said to me was, can you get my daughter back? And I said, I cannot. And she said, then you cannot do anything for me. You have nothing to offer me. And I said, yeah, I get that. Can I just sit with you? And I just rubbed her back while she threw up. Eventually, she co-regulated with me just from sitting. She co-regulated, and I asked her if she wanted to take a walk. And we walked, and I just helped her engage her senses in the butterfly garden, the playground. That was it. That was the only thing I could do for her. That was the only thing I could do for her. She gave me a hug. And she said, you did help. And that gave me so much hope. You know, the way that we're all trained is to do this assessment and this diagnosis and this treatment plan and this outcome measures. And it doesn't work like that with this population. It's very, very different. Intense shame and guilt. Intense. I worked with another woman who was kidnapped with her son. And the torture, the classic torture method with the cartel is starvation. It's cheap. And so they starve the people that they have kidnapped. And she and her son were in captivity for 2 months. Can you imagine what that's like? To watch your son emaciate? And she was just devastated that she had done this to him. They let her brother eventually paid ransom, and they let her son go. But they dumped him in the middle of nowhere. 6-year-old boy. Just dumped him in the middle of nowhere. And she saw the footage of when he was picked up. Border Patrol picked him up, and there was body cam footage, and she saw that. And how do you help somebody who's living with that? Yeah, really, 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 really devastating consequences for human beings. However you feel about immigration policy, how do you feel about human beings? These are people who live in they're within a 1 mile radius of. Okay, so important to recognize in this particular work that you cannot do traditional mental health. For all of those reasons, there's this incredible activation, arousal, hyperarousal, mistrust, lack of time, lack of space to do this work. And so what we do is really stabilization. It's stabilization. So there's a lot of humanitarian groups. There's Team Brownsville that I'm incredibly proud of. They are retired, mostly retired teachers. They show up every single day to feed people and make sure people have tents and make sure that they've got clean water. They raise money to pay for somebody to clean porta potties. They're just unbelievable. So the basic services and security, all met by humanitarian groups in the community. City doesn't help. There's no government agency saying, we'll house you all, we'll make sure that your health needs are met. It's all volunteers that show up every day and do just the basics of feeding and keeping people clean. The next tier on the pyramid of intervention is to connect people with their family. And this is a really, really powerful intervention. I met a guy at La Posada who was mowing the lawn, and this other guy, who word of mouth is really big. Once somebody trusts you, they're like, we'll bring you more people. Mm-hmm. So there was this gentleman mowing the lawn, and the other client that I had just had went and got him. He was like, no, I'm mowing the lawn. I don't want to do counseling or anything. He was like, no, really, you should do it. You should try it. It'll make you feel better. So he came and he sat down with me, and I said, hey, what's going on? How are you? How did you come to be sitting here? And, typical story, but I said, what's bothering you the most? And he said, well, I lost my phone in the river. I lost my phone. And my family hasn't heard from me in 6 months. They have no idea if I'm dead or alive. And I can't get in touch with them. Their phone numbers were stored in my phone. I don't know their phone numbers. And he said, I just hate it that my family doesn't know that I'm alive. So again, this guilt and this shame that he's alive, he's in this refugee shelter, he has a place to put his head down, but he thinks his family's grieving for him. So I said, well, do they have Facebook? He was like, oh, what's that? And I said, it's this thing on the internet where people sign up and they post pictures and stuff. And I said, here, I'll show you. So I pull out my phone and I open up my Facebook and I said, give me a name. So he gives me the name of his sister. We get a match. Wow. How crazy is that? We get a match. And so immediately I send her a message. And I'm like, hey, my name is so-and-so. I'm sitting with your brother who is alive and well. Contact us. And it took about 6 or 7 hours, but she messaged me back. I know. Goosebumps. Goosebumps on goosebumps, these stories. And so it's like midnight and I call the shelter and I'm like, you gotta get this guy, you gotta wake him up. Go get him, we gotta tell him. His sister, messaged me back. Get him on the phone. Here's her number. so powerful to help people reconnect with their loved ones, and so incredibly unfair that they have been disconnected from their loved ones. It's hard for us to imagine. It's really hard for us to imagine what that's like. So the next tier is focused care, and this can be psychological first aid done by lay people. And then the top tier is specialized care. So where we focus our work is in the focused care and the specialized care. We let the humanitarian groups do the first two, but we're always in contact with them. We're a pretty tight network, and we all try to work together and make sure that people are as resourced as possible. So this is La Posada. This is a refugee shelter. They've got about 30 beds. Border Patrol sends over what they consider really vulnerable cases, so people who are sick, people who have really young children, people who have mental health issues. So it's a pretty elite group that gets to come to La Posada, run by nuns from Philadelphia. And they started it about 30 years ago. They were not prepared for Central American migrants. We had to do a lot of trauma-informed care because the nuns had this system of being really, really strict and re-traumatizing people. So we did a lot of training. They're good people. This is one of my favorite offices where I do a lot of counseling. And it's a very rural area, so there's lots of little spots where we can sit and do counseling. So, once MPP started, we stopped seeing people coming into the United States, and we realized, oh man, we've got to get to them. So we've got to go into Matamoros. I asked Fred Bimak and Rita Chung for help. They are the founders of Counselors Without Borders. They're both professors emeritus at George Mason. I was privileged to get to know them in my work with Counselors for Social Justice. I called them and I said, how do you do international counseling? Like, who do you talk to about licensing, about certification, about codes of ethics? How do you do all of that? And so they mentored me through that first phase of CWB, where we were going into the tent camps. And these are just pictures of some of the work that we did. My house was a staging ground for all kinds of stuff that would come in from all over the place. People would send us supplies. And we would just go in and work with folks. We would just walk the grounds and ask kids if they wanted to play. And we would teach parents how to play with their kids, using a lot of bilateral stimulation to soothe the nervous system. But we would just sit in tents, talk to people. Then COVID, so we couldn't go into the tent camps, so we had to reconfigure everything. And so with Fred and Rita, we decided, well, this is getting bigger than just Matamoros. I can't go to Matamoros anymore, so let's do CWB Texas. So what we do now, we have a phased protocol for working with migrants, and all of this happens on the phone or on Zoom. And at La Posada, we still maintain on-site services at La Posada, but that's a very, very small group of people. So we do, if you remember the pyramid that we looked at before, we've got those top two tiers of focused care and that psychological first aid. We have trained our pre-practicum students to do that part. And then if people want to continue doing counseling, then they are referred to a practicum or internship student or a licensed mental health professional that volunteers services. So one of the things that I recognized early on was I'm not doing any good with person-centered counseling, right? I mean, the core conditions are fantastic and they're necessary, but I may see people one time, I may see them 2 times. They are very, very, they don't know what counseling is, for starters. There is really no such thing as counseling in the countries that they come from. And so they're not familiar with the service, don't like to disclose a lot. And so I thought, EMDR. And I trained to do EMDR, and it has been the most helpful thing. It has been such a great modality to use with this population. I want to say also that in spite of all of the things that I just said about how traumatized people are, this is also a population that is unbelievably strong. They are unbelievably strong. And so the people that ever actually need EMDR level work, very few. It's pretty rare. So you imagine that you have to be pretty strong to be able to leave your country, to be able to travel through Mexico, to survive the conditions at the border and the treatment that you get at the border. So these are people who are pretty, they're pretty strong. They tend to deteriorate once they have gotten to their destination, when they can let their breath out. So very, very few people at the very top. So we train in psychological first aid, and let's see what we're going here. Yeah, so our training actually was done by UNICEF. I'm a member of a really wonderful group called a Community of Practice in Immigration that spans the border from Texas to California, and really awesome groups participate in the Community of Practice, like UNICEF, UNHCR, Survivors of Torture, Jewish Family Services, lots of really, really good people. We're focused on mental health care needs. And so that's where I met my UNICEF people, and they provided the training, the psychological first aid training to all of our students. We trained about 20 students in psychological first aid. And then we decided, okay, so how do we do this? How do we get people to know that we're offering this service? So, hey, that wasn't supposed to happen, but here it is. So we created an online intake system, and obviously this is available in Spanish, the one on the left, and we have different designs geared towards children, adolescent, men, women, and once you hit that QR code, it takes you to a very brief intake, just really contact information and availability. Then that downloads into a spreadsheet, and students have access to the spreadsheet, and they can go and say, okay, here's somebody who's available Monday at 3, I'm available Monday at 3, and they'll claim that person, give them a call, and then they have this really specific structured protocol that they go through. If the person wants to continue talking to them, they can keep talking to them. If they want to do counseling, then they refer them to an internship student, a practicum or internship student, or they'll refer them to me if they say, you know what, this is somebody who needs a little bit more help than what we can probably do. And then the other flyer is for our humanitarian workers and attorneys. Our humanitarian workers are highly, highly susceptible to vicarious trauma. They hold really, really difficult stories. My caseload, I do any work with immigrant-related folks pro bono. And part of my caseload that has really been growing is immigration attorneys. That's why I don't want my child to be an immigration attorney, because I know what it's like hearing from my clients. It's really, really, really tough work. Really tough work. So, let me see if I can go back. So after we do the intake, we focus on attunement and attuned support. So what does that mean? Have you heard of this? you know what attuned support is? So for one thing, we recognize that trauma is not a deficit in a person. So trauma has a social location outside of the person. People are responding appropriately to the human rights violations that they are victims of. And we make sure that they know that. We make sure to tell them, your body's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Given your circumstances, there's nothing wrong with you. Your body is doing what it needs to do. This should not be happening. And I also love to tell people, there's an army out here working on your behalf. And I'm sorry that this is happening to you. Also, another point is that there is no post in PTSD. It is ongoing, active, day-to-day trauma that these folks are experiencing. The other thing is that we work out of a principle of political empathy. I mean, we validate for people. This shouldn't be happening to you. This is not right. I love the term legitimized suffering. We help them legitimize their suffering as a way of understanding what's happening to them, as a way of validating what they've been through, instead of pathologizing it. And then finally, we make sure that our therapists know where they are located. So unfortunately, the majority of us participate in the very systems that are damaging and hurtful to people. So dismantling structural and systemic traumatization looks like going out into the field and working in the field and not expecting people to make an appointment with us and come to an office and be able to pay for our services. We recognize that's not going to happen, and we go out into the field. We also actively and deliberately fight the systems that perpetuate all of these violations. I just want to share with you, let's see if I can open this link. This is just one example of an activist group. Show you their website real quick so you can see what they do. So this group was formed, oh, you can't see that, can you? Let me see if I can fix that. Still nothing? All right, we won't do that. So what they do is they, sorry guys. What they do is they have curriculum and teach people about the history of immigration, the history of crimmigration, the militarization of the border. It's an activist group. One of the things that I'm most proud of with this group is a curriculum that we wrote. I'm sure there was an easier way to do this, I'm really sorry. So one of the things I'm most proud of with this group is that we wrote a curriculum called a healing circle training, and we didn't invent healing circles, but we wrote the curriculum for healing circles, and it's being used in lots of places to train therapists to do a more culturally appropriate kind of therapy with people. And it's been picked up, the training has been picked up by some really impressive groups, like the Detention Watch Network has done our training. So just being a part of, and there are lots of organizations that do activist mental health work. So we teach our students that. We'll probably maybe get fired for it, but I feel like it's really necessary. All right, so then after that phase 1, if clients want to, they go to phase 2. And we use a protocol called Moving On After Trauma. This was shared with me by a woman named Mary Griggs, who works for the National Health Service in England, and did some research on whether this works. This is a stabilization program. So I emailed her and I said, hey, can I use this? And she said, absolutely. So the first part is psychoeducation. First of all, we need to teach people what counseling is, because they don't have that understanding and that model. So we teach them what counseling is. We also teach them about nervous system and their bodies and what is happening, why their bodies are reacting the way that they are, so that we can normalize that a little bit. Then we teach them nervous system regulation. So that's going to look like what? What are some of our nervous system regulation? Exactly. Yeah, breathing, grounding, did I hear?
Cross-body movement.
Yes, bilateral stuff, cross-body movements, sensory stimulation, excellent. Yeah, just these skills that they can use to regulate their body so that they can keep moving. So our whole goal is just to stabilize clients so that they can keep moving. And then of course we use the window of tolerance as one of our main interventions. So the theory of the window of tolerance is that, and it's similar to polyvagal theory. Our bodies throughout the day regulate and dysregulate based on our neuroception, right? We're always scanning the environment for safety. Our brainstem does this automatically without our permission. And when our brainstem senses some kind of a threat, some kind of a danger, for me it's when people don't smile back at me. My brainstem goes a little haywire, and then my body starts to dysregulate, right? You can up-regulate or down-regulate. If you are up-regulating, in that little window where it says can't calm down, that's when you're starting to feel a little bit dysregulated. That's where we teach people, use those skills, bring those skills in, whichever one works for you, the breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, grounding, visualization, confidence cards, pictures of your loved ones, whatever it is, we teach them to recognize that first sign that something's going wrong and implement those strategies. In the window of tolerance, people can think clearly, they can problem solve, they can figure out what their next step is. So we teach them, that's the key. You've got to stay in that space and not let your body hijack you. So we kind of are externalizing these symptoms and helping them understand this is, you can do this. You can regulate your body so that you can think what your next move is going to be. And it's been really effective. It's been really effective. So we teach all of these. We have a menu of skills and use that a lot. So, any questions about the window of tolerance or nervous system regulation, or why that's our approach? So again, it's about stabilization. We're not going to do traditional therapy. People are not going to come to my office, and even if I am going to where they are at the shelter, they're a very transient population. I may see them one time. If I'm lucky, I'll see them 2 or 3 times. But when we teach them these skills, they can get where they're going. They can keep thinking and keep moving. And that's our goal. Obviously, we also teach them when you get where you're going, you might fall apart. Once you're safe, once you feel like you can actually let that gate down. And when that happens, here's a list of people in your destination city that do this kind of work and can help you. But for us, it's just about stabilization and attunement. So hard for our students to learn, so hard for our students to understand, because they really, really want to diagnose, and they really want to write a treatment plan and do interventions. So it's a little bit of, it's a different paradigm. But I think also they see how effective what they're doing is. Just sitting with somebody, just being with somebody. If you speak Spanish, you might have heard the saying, and it's something that I always heard at funerals, but I use it so much now. And the saying is, "Te acompaño en tu dolor," which means I will accompany you in your pain. And that's kind of our, our foundational philosophy. It's really helpful. So, what about self-care? What happens to the helpers? So, not just our students, but the humanitarian aid workers, the attorneys, the people who work in shelters, the people who work at the courthouses. I worked with a guy who said he was having auditory hallucinations of chains clanging. He was the guy who did the shackles at the courthouse, and he said it was just driving him nuts. He could not get that sound out of his head. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but it was his job. He had to provide for his family. But that sound was constantly reinforcing for him, you shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. You shouldn't be putting this with your chains. So we are an entire community that is traumatized. We also live in the shadow of the border wall. And so we experience what is called wall disease. Yeah. Always that big, ugly structure reminding us we're cutting you off from your people. Because the majority of us, it's a very fluid border. We have family that live in Mexico. We come and go. We always have. And now there's this big wall that's this constant reminder. Your people are not wanted here. And there's also, there's border patrol everywhere. On our campus is on the river. And so a lot of times, whenever there's any kind of a security issue, Border Patrol is the first law enforcement to get there. And it's hard for our students. Most of our students have mixed status families. Some of the folks are documented, some aren't. And so seeing Border Patrol is just, activates us immediately. So one of the things that's really important about vicarious trauma is that the more you care, the harder it hits you. And most of us are really caring people, aren't we? We're very compassionate people to begin with. And so this kind of stuff affects us very strongly. So we teach all of our community, be aware. First thing, be aware. Do body scans constantly. What's going on in your body? Pay attention to it. Use your regulation skills that you know how to use. Doing emotional status checks. Doing assessments of their interpersonal relationships, because a lot of times that's where that trauma shows up. I don't want to be around people, or I'm clingy, or I'm irritable, and it shows up in our relationships. And then teaching people also, evaluate yourself. How are you doing at school? Are you keeping up? How are you doing at work? Are you hitting your KPIs? So just being aware, and then teaching them to balance, making sure they're counteracting those negative experiences with play and with rest. And then of course there's guilt. Everybody feels so guilty if they rest or they play, but it's absolutely necessary. But guilt is the number one thing I deal with all of our aid folks and lawyers. One of my clients has this memory of being in Mexico and people literally grabbing her, just a crowd of people surrounding her and grabbing her and saying, please, 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 please help me, take me, take my case. And you can't take all of them. And so her recurring intrusive thought was people just grabbing her. And when I say to her, slow down, you need to rest, her response is, I can't. There's all those people that need help. So teaching her, you can't help them if you're constantly activated. You're not going to do anybody any good. So what happens is when people don't balance out all of those negative things is they become very resentful, they become exhausted, and they quit. They check out. And so it's really, really, really important to play and rest. And then of course to connect with other people. We're social beings. When you are exhausted from this work, the only thing you want to do is crawl into bed and not, but that's sometimes not a great thing to do. You need to be with people, you need to connect with people. We do a lot of debriefing. Our supervision is a lot of debriefing. And just making sure that people feel the energy of each other and support each other. Again, if you speak Spanish, you've probably heard this, no hay mal que por bien no venga. What's the English translation of that? Yeah, no bad that good can't heal, no bad that good doesn't come from. So it's the silver lining, the silver lining quote. There's usually a silver lining, and so there's a lot of people that are doing work around post-traumatic growth and vicarious resilience, which I love this idea of vicarious resilience instead of vicarious trauma, kind of the antidote. And what the scholars have found is that when we work with traumatized populations, we are positively, fundamentally changed. We change our goals and our priorities. We have increased hopefulness and client-based inspiration. I cannot tell you what a gift it is to work with this population. and the people that I have built relationships with and come to know, and to learn from them. How they get up and do it again and again and again every day, and still show grace, and still show humor. I have learned so much and been so inspired by the people that I work with. It changes your spiritual beliefs, and definitely has changed my practice around the therapeutic process, around what I believe people need. And what I believe that people need is me just to be with them. First and foremost, just to be with them. Just to hold their hand, rub their back while they're throwing up. Just to be with them. And that's very different from the way that I was trained and the way that I was programmed to work. Increase in self-care practices. This is true. If you've got the right community, we're all encouraging each other. We're all supporting each other to rest, to take time out, to play. Obviously, one is that we realize how privileged we are when you work with this population. Really, really hard to complain about maybe your shower pressure isn't so good. It changes you. It changes you. And then obviously an increased racial, cultural, structural consciousness, awareness of what my social location is and where I want it to be. So I want to finish with a story, obviously a stock photo, but this is one of those stories that, I've told you a lot of painful stories. This is a great story. I met this young man in a detention center for kids. Brownsville has a lot of detention centers for unaccompanied minors. And the largest one is in this, it's the weirdest thing, it's so surreal. It's in an old Walmart, and it holds about 1,500 young men between the ages of 12 to 17. And when you walk in, it's a little city inside of Walmart. There are streets with street names. Yeah, it's surreal. It's surreal. There's like barber shops and doctor's offices and dorms and play areas and eating areas. But it's so big that there are literally street names and addresses in there. So I meet this kid. He's from Honduras. He's about 13 years old. And his situation is that he doesn't have a dad, and he's the oldest kid in his family. And the family's really, really struggling. And so he makes the decision to leave his family, travel through Mexico, so that he can get a job here and send money to help his mom and his younger siblings. On the way, he meets another kid who is, I think he's from El Salvador, totally different situation. Orphaned when he was very young, has been living on the streets by himself for most of his life. And these two kids bond. And they surrender at the border together, and they get placed into the same detention center together. It's called Casa Padre. And they have this, this brotherhood that's really, really nice. And so I'm assigned to the first kid who has family resources or emotional resources, right? And every time we meet, he wants to make things for his siblings or for this other friend of his. And the day comes where he gets his is he gets notice that he's going to be moved to a group home in Michigan. And I'm really happy for him because he's going to get out of this really difficult place to live. One of the things that's so difficult about child detention is that these are kids who have had agency. They're very, very used to directing their own lives. They're very capable of directing their own lives. Really, really little kids who've had to survive. They've had to feed themselves and take care of themselves without an adult, and they do it. They're capable of doing it. When they get to the detention centers, it is a completely different situation. They are told when to go to sleep, what time to wake up. They're literally told how much time they have in the bathroom and when they can use the bathroom. Every single second of their day is directed, and it's a very, very difficult transition for them. So this kid, I'm so excited, and he's like, I can't go. I can't go. I can't go. And I'm like, what are you talking about? This is great news. And he says, no, because I can't leave, we'll call him Johnny. I can't leave Johnny here. He doesn't have anybody. I can't leave him here. And I'm like, don't worry, his day will come. He's going to leave too. Then you guys can get together. And he's like, no, you don't understand. He won't. He doesn't have anybody. I can't go. So anyway, takes some work, but we get him to where he's okay. And he wants to make Johnny a cross, a necklace. And so he asks me, can you get me these things so that I can make him this necklace that'll protect him while I'm gone? Mm-hmm. So I get him the stuff. He's also very unreasonable about the stuff that he wants. I keep bringing him, he wants a cross. So I bring him, okay, no, that's not it. I don't like that one. I'm like, okay. So it took like 3 different tries before we hit the right one. So he makes him this beautiful, really was beautiful cross as a necklace, gives it to him, and leaves, and he's gone. And I decide, I'm not going to do this child advocacy thing for a while. I need a break. I'm not going to do it. But then I get called a couple of weeks later, and because there's a child in need, a child with mental health issues. And so they're like, can you please spend some time with this kid? Okay, so my first interview with the kid, I'm talking to him, and I'm like, so, what's bothering you? What's been the hardest part? And he says, well, the only person in the world that I can count on left me. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he tells me this story about how he was traveling through Mexico, and he met this kid, and they took care of each other. And they surrendered together, were detained together. And he's the only brother I have, he's the only family I have, and he abandoned. And I'm going, sounds really familiar. And I said, did he left? Did he give you something? And he said, yeah. And I asked him to describe it. And I was like, this is crazy, because to get assigned, there's literally thousands of kids. To get assigned to Johnny was crazy. And so I told him, he didn't abandon you, he didn't want to leave you. He had to go, and you're going to be fine, and you're going to go too. But it was a long time before he went. In the meantime, he had 3 suicide attempts. Because it was so hard for him to be there, and to be there by himself, and to constantly be told, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. It was just really hard for him. 3 suicide attempts. And so, against the rules, I start looking for this other kid. And finally, I find him. He's on Facebook. Y'all can't tell anybody this. I find it was on Facebook. And so I messaged him and I said, you are not going to believe this. I met Johnny. I work with Johnny. And he's like, no way, this can't be happening. And so Johnny's, I think it was his 16th birthday, in detention. We got the other kid on a video call to tell him happy birthday. There's not even words to describe what that was like for him to see his friend. Eventually, he got released, and every once in a while they check in with me. They're in contact. They're not in the same states, but they're in contact, and they will be lifelong brothers. There are so many beautiful stories out there. The gifts that I've been given working with this population are invaluable. It's really, really hard work. It's very demanding. It's unconventional. We fly by the seat of our pants. But we meet the most amazing people. It's life-changing. Thank you.